The Monsters of Chernobyl, Legends and Reality. The Chernobyl disaster and its aftermath. The Chernobyl disaster was a horrific nuclear accident that took place at reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, located near the city of Pripyat in northern Ukraine. The explosion released vast amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere, contaminating large parts of Europe, but especially affecting areas in the Soviet Union. The immediate consequences of the explosion included the deaths of 2 plant workers and the eventual deaths of many more due to acute radiation sickness and long-term cancer effects. In the aftermath of the explosion, the Soviet government evacuated over 100,000 people from the surrounding towns and villages, creating a vast 30-kilometer exclusion zone around the reactor. The area remains largely uninhabited to this day, creating a ghostly, post-apocalyptic landscape that has fueled numerous myths, including the notion of mutated creatures, monsters born of the radiation's unnatural influence. Radiation and its effects on wildlife. Before exploring the legends, it's important to understand the reality of radiation and its effects on the natural world. Radiation can cause mutations in the DNA of living organisms, leading to abnormal growths, deformities, and other long-term genetic effects. However, the immediate aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster did not result in an explosion of horrific mutations among the local wildlife. Studies conducted in the exclusion zone have found that many species of animals, plants, and insects have survived in the region. However, some mutations have been observed in certain species, including deformed amphibians. Some studies have reported abnormal growths in frogs and other amphibians within the exclusion zone. Deformities include extra limbs and unusual skin pigmentation. Larger-than-life creatures. The wildlife in the zone, particularly the populations of wild boar, wolves, and elk, have thrived in the absence of human interference, leading to the perception of these animals as monstrous due to their increased size and strength. Yet, their size and success are likely due to a lack of predators, not radiation. Despite these findings, the true scale of radiation-induced mutations in wildlife is not as widespread or grotesque as the rumors suggest. Most species living in the zone have adapted well to the environment, and many of the fears of radiation-induced monsters appear to be based more on myth and imagination than reality. The birth of Chernobyl myths. After the disaster, the Chernobyl exclusion zone became a fertile ground for the imagination. The eerie, abandoned towns and villages, along with the haunting silence of the ghost town of Pripyat, added to the allure of Chernobyl as a place of mystery and fear. Over time, the disaster inspired numerous myths and urban legends about mutated animals, radioactive creatures, and even monstrous human-like entities. Several key figures in the monster mythology emerged. The Chernobyl mutant. Perhaps the most enduring and frightening of the Chernobyl myths is that of the Chernobyl mutant, a creature said to have been spawned by the radiation from the explosion. Descriptions of these mutants vary widely, but they often resemble grotesque versions of familiar animals, giant, mutated wolves, grotesque birds, or deformed humanoid creatures. While these stories are terrifying, they are not grounded in scientific reality. The chupacabra of Chernobyl. In addition to mutated creatures, the Chernobyl zone has been linked to stories of the chupacabra, a mythical creature said to drink the blood of livestock. Some locals and visitors claim to have seen a version of the chupacabra within the exclusion zone, attributing the creature's appearance to the radioactive effects of the disaster. The chupacabra, however, is a well-known legend from Puerto Rico and Latin America, and its presence in Chernobyl seems to be a blending of 2 disparate myths. The ghosts of Chernobyl. In addition to mutated creatures, many stories tell of ghosts and apparitions wandering the desolate landscape of Chernobyl. Visitors report eerie feelings, strange sounds, and sightings of spectral figures in the abandoned buildings and deserted streets. These supernatural stories, though captivating, are a result of the chilling atmosphere of the site and the haunting memory of the disaster, rather than actual hauntings. The influence of pop culture. Pop culture has played a significant role in shaping the myth of the monsters of Chernobyl. Films, video games, and books have used the exclusion zone as a backdrop for stories of radiation-induced horrors. One of the most well-known examples is the video game series STLKER, which takes place in a fictionalized version of the Chernobyl zone and features mutated monsters and dangerous environments. The success of the game and its depiction of the zone as a radioactive wasteland populated by terrifying creatures has further cemented the idea of Chernobyl as a place of monstrous phenomena. In films, documentaries, and television shows, the Chernobyl disaster is often portrayed as a source of horror, with mutated creatures serving as a symbol of the disaster's unknown and uncontrollable consequences. Chernobyl Diaries, 2012, is one such film that capitalizes on the fear of radiation and mutant creatures, blending horror and thriller genres to create a chilling fictional narrative set in the exclusion zone. Separating fact from fiction. While the stories of mutated creatures and ghosts at Chernobyl are fascinating, it's important to remember that much of what has been told is based on fiction, hearsay, and cultural imagination rather than verified scientific findings. The real legacy of Chernobyl is the devastating human impact, the lives lost, the illnesses caused by radiation exposure, and the destruction of an entire community. The physical environment has slowly begun to recover over the decades, with wildlife returning and thriving, even as human presence remains minimal. The monsters of Chernobyl are best understood not as literal creatures but as cultural symbols. They represent humanity's fears of the unknown, of uncontrolled technology, and of the lasting consequences of nuclear disasters. They also reflect how our minds, in the face of such horrors, often create stories to make sense of the world around us, especially when confronted with something as incomprehensible as the Chernobyl disaster. Conclusion. The monsters of Chernobyl remain a mix of myth and reality shaped by the human imagination, fear of radiation, and the enduring legacy of one of the most catastrophic events in modern history. While there is some truth to the radiation-induced mutations in wildlife, the grotesque and terrifying creatures that populate the legends of Chernobyl are largely the product of folklore and pop culture. The real story of Chernobyl is a reminder of the power of nature and the dangers of tampering with forces beyond our understanding. In the end, Chernobyl's true monsters are not the mutated animals or the ghosts of the past, but the devastating effects of human error, negligence, and the consequences of unchecked technological ambition. The birth of the myths, the Chernobyl disaster, and the creation of mutated monster legends. The Chernobyl disaster of 1986 is one of the most significant and catastrophic events in human history, not just because of the devastating human toll, but also due to its lasting impact on popular culture, the public imagination, and the formation of myths. While the explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant caused immediate and undeniable damage to the environment and human life, it also gave birth to a host of mysterious and often grotesque legends. Among the most enduring myths are those surrounding mutated creatures, beasts twisted by the effects of radiation and lurking in the abandoned towns and forests surrounding the disaster site. These legends, while largely fictional, were fueled by a combination of sensational media coverage, government secrecy, public fear, and popular culture. In this article, we will explore how the myths of mutated creatures around Chernobyl were born and how they continue to shape the narrative of the disaster even today. Media sensationalism, the power of exaggeration and fabrication. In the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster, sensational stories spread like wildfire. In the early days, the Soviet government sought to suppress information about the extent of the disaster, limiting the flow of accurate data. As a result, the media quickly took the lead in spreading whatever information was available, sometimes factual, but often exaggerated or completely fabricated. Media outlets around the world picked up on reports of deformed plants and animals, many of which were seen in the contaminated areas near Chernobyl. In the absence of reliable information, reporters were eager to sensationalize the unknown. The language of the time often included descriptions of grotesque mutants and monstrous creatures roaming the abandoned areas of the Chernobyl exclusion zone. These creatures were often presented as terrifying entities, drawn from a modern-day horror film script. The lack of verifiable data surrounding the effects of radiation in those early years allowed such reports to flourish. These stories, no matter how outlandish or unfounded, were often repeated by different media outlets, creating a viral effect that solidified the myth of Chernobyl's monsters. The idea of mutated creatures roaming the wasteland became as much a part of the narrative as the human tragedy itself. Secrecy and fear, filling the information void. The Soviet government's attempts to cover up the scale of the disaster contributed greatly to the proliferation of myths. Initially, the Soviet Union downplayed the event, offering little more than vague statements about the extent of the damage. At the same time, much of the information was kept under wraps, particularly regarding the long-term health effects of radiation exposure. This secrecy created a vacuum in which rumors and wild speculation could thrive. In a world with limited access to information and government-controlled media, people turned to less reliable sources. Local residents, workers, and those who managed to escape from the region began circulating stories about strange occurrences, unexplainable phenomena, and the appearance of mutated animals. In an environment dominated by uncertainty and fear, it was easy to let the imagination run wild, and rumors about mutated monsters quickly gained traction. The absence of a clear understanding of the radiation's effects allowed these rumors to persist. Without knowledge about the true long-term environmental impacts of nuclear exposure, people assumed that radiation could create all manner of unnatural creatures. This fear, compounded by the government's tight control over the narrative, made it much easier for the legend of mutated beasts to grow. Scientific mysteries, the unknown and the unfamiliar. Radiation, particularly in the aftermath of a nuclear disaster, is an incredibly complex and difficult subject for the general public to fully grasp. The effects of radiation on living organisms are not immediately visible, and often take years to manifest in harmful ways. As such, the science of radiation remained a mysterious and frightening concept for most people. This lack of understanding opened the door for wild theories. People speculated that radiation could warp the genetic structure of living organisms, resulting in horrific mutations. Mutated creatures became a way to express the fear of the unknown, a physical manifestation of the dangers posed by the unseen force of radiation. In the absence of any concrete scientific understanding of what was happening in the affected zones, myths about grotesque, mutated creatures seemed just as plausible as any other explanation. The more fantastical the stories, the more they captured the imagination of the public. Could animals be transformed into monstrous forms by the power of radiation? In a time when science could not immediately explain the scope of the disaster, these questions seemed to have an air of credibility. Pop culture, amplifying the legend. The myth of Chernobyl's mutated creatures was not limited to news stories or rumors passed by word of mouth. It quickly found a place in popular culture. In the years following the disaster, movies, video games, books, and other media began to amplify and expand upon the legends of mutated monsters inhabiting the region around Chernobyl. Films such as Stalker, 1979, based on the novel by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky, set the stage for a dystopian, radiation-infested world. Later works, including the Stalker video game series, 2007, and the 2019 Chernobyl TV miniseries, continued to weave these legends into their narratives. These media often presented the exclusion zone as a place of danger, inhabited by twisted creatures and ghostly remnants of a lost civilization. By blending horror and science fiction, pop culture cemented the idea that the region around Chernobyl was home to monstrous beings. The video game series Stalker, in particular, gained a large following and further popularized the idea of mutated creatures, such as horrific, mutated dogs, boars, and humans, within the Chernobyl zone. These fictional accounts often presented the monsters as both a threat and a consequence of radiation, making them a symbol of the disaster's long-lasting and terrifying effects. These representations were, of course, far removed from reality, but they served to further entrench the idea that Chernobyl was a cursed, dangerous place teeming with horrific, mutated life forms. The persistence of the myth. Even decades after the Chernobyl disaster, the myth of mutated creatures continues to live on. Urban legends, documentaries, and even social media platforms continue to circulate stories and images of bizarre and deformed creatures supposedly found in the region. These tales have become part of a broader cultural fascination with abandoned places, radiation, and the supernatural. The exclusion zone, which remains largely uninhabited, has become a kind of modern-day forbidden zone, drawing tourists, scientists, and thrill-seekers eager to explore the mystery of the place. While the real scientific work conducted in the region shows that radiation does indeed have a detrimental effect on wildlife, the level of mutation and the fear of monsters remain mostly myths, exaggerated for dramatic effect. Moreover, modern advancements in science have shown that while Chernobyl's environment is undoubtedly affected by radiation, the surviving animals and plants are not grotesque mutants, but rather survivors of a harsh environment. Still, the image of mutated monsters is a persistent one, which speaks to the enduring power of fear, uncertainty, and the imagination in shaping human history and folklore. Conclusion. The myth of mutated creatures in Chernobyl's aftermath is a testament to the power of fear, the unknown, and the human tendency to create stories around incomprehensible events. Fueled by media sensationalism, government secrecy, a lack of scientific understanding, and a thriving pop culture industry, these legends have become an inseparable part of Chernobyl's legacy. Whether perpetuated through fiction or urban legend, the idea of horrific, mutated beasts continues to captivate and haunt the collective imagination. Even as the real-world effects of the Chernobyl disaster are understood more clearly, the myth of monsters in the zone lives on, reminding us of the ways in which stories are born from tragedy and fueled by the unknown. Radiation, especially in the wake of major nuclear incidents like Chernobyl, has had a notable, albeit often complex, impact on flora and fauna. While the immediate effects may seem dramatic, many of the long-term consequences are more subtle or involve gradual adaptation. Below are further insights into how radiation affects different aspects of the environment. Flora, plants. Acute radiation effects. Red Forest. The area near Chernobyl, dubbed the Red Forest, is an iconic example where radiation caused mass tree death. Pine trees turned red as the result of radiation poisoning, and the trees eventually died. The radiation levels were so high that the forest ecosystem experienced severe damage. Reduction in biodiversity. While radiation did not cause a complete wipeout of plant life, many species faced challenges. The diversity of plant species in contaminated areas diminished over time, as those unable to survive the higher radiation levels gradually vanished. Mutations. Studies have documented mutations in plants in the contaminated zones, ranging from minor changes in leaf color to more pronounced deformities. These genetic mutations can lead to reduced fertility, stunted growth, and malformed reproductive organs, which affect the plant's ability to thrive and reproduce. Some mutations are relatively harmless, but in other cases, they can be detrimental to the survival of the plants, especially in the long term. Fauna, animals. Insects. Insects, such as butterflies, show significant deformities, including asymmetrical wings and reduced size, likely caused by radiation exposure during early life stages. The mutations are often passed down to successive generations, though some species seem to have adapted over time. However, the overall population of many insect species, like moths and beetles, in the radioactive zones has been heavily affected by radiation. Birds. Studies on birds show that radiation exposure can lead to abnormalities, including albinism and malformed beaks, legs, and feathers. In some species, brain shrinkage has also been noted. Interestingly, these effects are often more pronounced in the second and third generations after the incident, indicating that radiation might be impacting genetic inheritance. Populations of birds in the Chernobyl exclusion zone have been significantly affected by these abnormalities, though they continue to survive and reproduce in the area, demonstrating a level of resilience. Larger mammals. Mammals, such as wild boars, wolves, and deer, have been observed in the Chernobyl zone, and while they often exhibit higher rates of tumors, genetic mutations, and other abnormalities, most of these animals appear to live relatively normal lives. Some populations have even thrived in the absence of human interference, despite the elevated radiation levels. This suggests a degree of adaptation, possibly due to the lack of predators or human hunters in the region. However, many individuals show signs of cancerous growths, reduced fertility, and other health issues that are likely a result of radiation exposure. Conclusion. The effects of radiation on flora and fauna can vary widely, depending on factors like species, the degree of exposure, and the length of time affected organisms are exposed to radiation. While the immediate damage to plant and animal life can be severe, many species are exhibiting resilience and adaptability in the long term. However, the presence of genetic mutations and deformities suggests that the full ecological impact of radiation will continue to unfold over generations. The study of the Chernobyl exclusion zone remains one of the best natural laboratories for understanding these long-term effects. Famous legends of Chernobyl monsters, myths and realities of the exclusion zone. The Chernobyl disaster of 1986 remains one of the most significant and terrifying events in human history, but its aftermath has also fostered an entire mythology surrounding strange creatures and monsters inhabiting the radioactive zone. The fascination with these supposed horrors has grown over time, fueled by the eerie silence of the abandoned cities, the radioactive environment, and the numerous stories that have been passed down through generations. This article delves into the most famous and chilling legends of Chernobyl's alleged monsters, shedding light on both the origins of these myths and the truth behind them. 1. The Blackbird of Chernobyl. Perhaps the most famous and eerie of Chernobyl's legendary creatures is the blackbird, often linked to the Mothman legend of American folklore. Descriptions of the blackbird paint it as a large, dark, bird-like creature with glowing red eyes, often said to have been sighted before the disaster struck. Witnesses recall feeling an overwhelming sense of dread upon encountering the creature, often accompanied by vivid nightmares and mysterious phone calls from an unknown source. Some claim that the creature warned of the impending nuclear catastrophe, while others believe it may have been an omen of doom. Interestingly, the blackbird legend emerged after the disaster, fueled by survivors' testimonies and the eerie atmosphere surrounding the event. While there is no concrete evidence to suggest that such a creature exists, the myth has persisted in popular culture, symbolizing the fear and tragedy of Chernobyl. Researchers and urban explorers continue to encounter accounts of hauntings and unusual phenomena in the exclusion zone, further cementing the blackbird's place in Chernobyl's folklore. 2. Giant mutant animals. Another pervasive myth surrounding Chernobyl's exclusion zone involves the existence of giant, mutated animals that were supposedly transformed by the extreme levels of radiation. Stories abound of oversized wolves, monstrous fish, and other creatures that have become exaggerated versions of their natural forms. One of the most common tales is of gigantic catfish lurking in the cooling ponds of the nuclear plant, said to be as large as small boats. In reality, while it is true that the catfish in the area can grow to impressive sizes, this is more likely due to their long lifespan and abundant food supply in the radioactive environment than any mutation caused by radiation. Similarly, other reports speak of mutant bears, oversized wild boars, and bizarre, hybrid creatures. The reality is that while the radioactive environment may have led to some mutations in the local wildlife, these creatures are not the enormous, dangerous beasts that the legends portray. Most of the wildlife in the area, despite the radiation, continues to thrive and evolve in the relatively undisturbed ecosystems of the zone. Nonetheless, the myth of giant mutants persists, inspiring horror stories and films about mutated creatures stalking the empty towns and forests of Chernobyl. 3. Humanoid mutants. One of the more terrifying and persistent myths involves humanoid mutants, grotesque, deformed figures with glowing eyes and superhuman strength. These mutants are often said to roam the abandoned cities, particularly Pripyat, the ghost town closest to the Chernobyl reactor. Descriptions vary, with some witnesses claiming that the mutants possess twisted, animal-like features, while others say they are more human in appearance, but with severe deformities caused by radiation exposure. Some stories claim that the mutants are incredibly aggressive, attacking anyone who dares to enter their domain. The humanoid mutant legend is largely inspired by video games and movies, such as the STALKER series and the film Chernobyl Diaries. These media representations of the exclusion zone have contributed significantly to the popular imagination of what life in Chernobyl might be like, filling it with danger and supernatural occurrences. However, there is no scientific basis for these legends, and the mutations caused by radiation in the real world are typically much subtler, affecting small organisms rather than creating monstrous humanoids. 4. Radioactive spiders and insects. The notion of radioactive spiders, insects, and other creatures growing to enormous sizes due to radiation is another myth that has found its way into the folklore of Chernobyl. In some stories, these creatures are portrayed as aggressive, their venom or bites capable of causing fatal mutations or even death. The idea of radioactive superbugs is largely rooted in science fiction, but the real-world consequences of radiation on smaller creatures are more nuanced. Insects and spiders in the exclusion zone have indeed been studied, and some abnormalities have been observed, including changes in color and behavior. However, no evidence suggests that any species has mutated to the extent of becoming giant or particularly dangerous to humans. In fact, radiation has caused many species to experience a decline in population, particularly among those that are more sensitive to environmental changes. The myth of radioactive insects may stem from the strange appearance of some of these creatures or the fear and mystery surrounding the zone. 5. The Shadow People of Chernobyl. Another creepy tale involves sightings of shadow people, vague, dark figures that seem to move just beyond the edge of one's vision. These shadowy entities are often said to appear in the abandoned buildings of Pripyat or the forests surrounding the reactor, lurking in the dark corners of the zone. While these stories are unsubstantiated, they reflect a common human fear of the unknown and the eerie feeling that can be experienced in the silent, deserted landscape of Chernobyl. The concept of shadow people has appeared in many paranormal legends worldwide, and it is possible that the intense emotional and psychological stress of the area contributes to the sightings of these figures. 6. The Chernobyl werewolf. Another creature tied to Chernobyl lore is the werewolf. According to the legend, a man who was exposed to the radioactive fallout was transformed into a werewolf-like creature that prowls the forests at night, hunting down anyone who dares to enter. This story is likely a mixture of traditional folklore and the more modern Chernobyl myths, fueled by the area's haunting atmosphere. Like the other legends, it serves as a way to explain the strange, unexplainable phenomena people encounter in the exclusion zone, where darkness and fear dominate the landscape. 7. The Chernobyl giant. An even more bizarre story is that of the Chernobyl giant, a massive, human-like figure that supposedly towers over the forests of the zone. Descriptions of the creature vary, but it is generally said to have an unnatural, towering stature, and to appear only at night, lurking near the reactor or the nearby woods. This myth echoes traditional stories of giants in folklore, but it also plays on fears of radiation and mutation, mixing supernatural elements with the real-world horror of the disaster. As with other myths, no scientific evidence supports the existence of such a being, but it remains part of Chernobyl's enduring mystique. Conclusion. The Chernobyl exclusion zone, with its haunting atmosphere and abandoned structures, has become the perfect setting for stories of strange creatures and terrifying phenomena. While the majority of these stories are rooted in folklore, fear, and imagination, they serve to illustrate the powerful emotions and intrigue surrounding the site of one of the most catastrophic nuclear disasters in history. Whether it's the blackbird, mutant animals, humanoid mutants, or shadowy figures, these Chernobyl legends continue to capture the fascination of people worldwide. However, it is important to remember that these stories, while fascinating, are myths and should not overshadow the real history of the disaster or the scientific study of the area. The role of pop culture in shaping perceptions of Chernobyl. Chernobyl, once a thriving Soviet city, became a symbol of devastation and environmental catastrophe following the catastrophic nuclear disaster of April 1986. The explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant not only claimed numerous lives but also displaced hundreds of thousands of people, leaving behind hauntingly empty towns and villages. Over the years, the Chernobyl exclusion zone has transformed from a place of tragedy into a cultural phenomenon. This eerie, radioactive landscape has become a muse for storytellers, filmmakers, and game developers, captivating imaginations with its chilling atmosphere, abandoned structures, and the haunting sense of a forgotten world. Chernobyl's dark legacy has permeated pop culture in ways that have blurred the lines between reality and myth, forever shaping public perception of the disaster. Pop culture has explored the Chernobyl exclusion zone through a variety of media, from video games to books to films, each adding their own layer to the mythos surrounding the site. While many of these works are fictional, they contribute to an increasingly complex and often misleading understanding of Chernobyl's impact on both the environment and those who were affected by the disaster. Video games. Chernobyl as a world of mutated horror. Video games have been among the most influential mediums in bringing the story of Chernobyl to a global audience. One of the most notable games to delve into the Chernobyl disaster and its aftermath is the STALKER series, which began with STLKER, Shadow of Chernobyl in 2007. This first-person shooter game places players in the role of a stalker, an adventurer who ventures into the Chernobyl exclusion zone to find artifacts and uncover secrets, all while avoiding mutated creatures and dangerous anomalies caused by the radiation. The STLKER series emphasizes a dystopian, post-apocalyptic setting, drawing heavily on the real-world landscape of Chernobyl, including its ruined structures, forests, and irradiated zones. However, the game takes significant creative liberties by incorporating supernatural elements, such as mutants, radioactive anomalies, and paranormal phenomena. This combination of real-world locations with supernatural horrors has become a hallmark of the game, solidifying Chernobyl's role in modern gaming as an atmospheric backdrop for apocalyptic storytelling. The Call of Duty franchise also embraced Chernobyl's haunting potential in its 2009 title Call of Duty: Modern Warfare 2. While not entirely centered on the exclusion zone, the game featured a mission in which players infiltrate the ruins of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant itself, encountering eerie environments and deadly enemies along the way. The mission, which famously includes a visit to Reactor 4, takes advantage of the radioactive setting to add a sense of danger and foreboding to the gameplay. These games have played a pivotal role in shaping popular perceptions of Chernobyl, associating the location with dangerous, mutated creatures, radioactive zones, and the eerie silence of abandoned cities. The sense of adventure and exploration, often combined with horrific encounters, creates a narrative that entertains but also distorts the real history of the disaster. Movies, Chernobyl's real locations, fictional horrors. Film has long been a medium through which the myths surrounding Chernobyl have been explored and expanded. While the majority of films focusing on Chernobyl emphasize the disaster's real-world impacts, others delve into the world of horror, mixing fact with fiction to create unnerving, tense narratives. One of the most famous films to exploit the Chernobyl setting is Chernobyl Diaries, 2012. Directed by Bradley Parker, the film follows a group of American tourists who visit Chernobyl to tour the exclusion zone, only to encounter supernatural horrors and dangerous secrets. While the film plays fast and loose with the facts surrounding the disaster and the exclusion zone, it successfully taps into the eerie atmosphere of the site, using real footage of Chernobyl's abandoned towns and the stark beauty of its desolation. The Chernobyl Diaries is just one example of a broader trend in horror films, which capitalize on the idea that Chernobyl's desolate environment and lingering radiation serve as the perfect breeding ground for ghostly phenomena, mutated creatures, and deadly dangers. This sense of the uncanny and unsettling mix of real-world history and supernatural terror has become a defining feature of many Chernobyl-themed films, further cementing the idea of Chernobyl as a place where reality and myth collide. Books, The Silent Witness of Radiation. Literature has also played a key role in exploring the human side of Chernobyl's story. Authors have written extensively about the lives of those affected by the disaster, capturing the emotional and psychological aftermath of the event. However, many of these works also incorporate elements of science fiction and the supernatural, making Chernobyl not just a symbol of a real-life tragedy but also a fertile ground for speculative narratives. One of the most famous works of fiction inspired by Chernobyl is Roadside Picnic, 1972, by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. Although it was written before the Chernobyl disaster, the novel's influence on Chernobyl-based fiction is undeniable. Roadside Picnic tells the story of a post-apocalyptic landscape, where a mysterious zone contains artifacts and anomalies with dangerous, otherworldly properties. The Strugatskys' novel directly inspired the STLKER game series, further linking the idea of Chernobyl with a zone of strange occurrences and eerie, dangerous environments. Other authors have followed in similar footsteps, crafting stories that blend real accounts of the disaster with fictionalized elements. Books like Chernobyl, The Lost World by Andrew Leatherbarrow and Voices from Chernobyl by Svetlana Alexievich explore the tragedy from the perspective of those who lived through it. However, even these works often introduce elements of the supernatural, such as ghost stories and legends of mutated creatures, reinforcing the idea of Chernobyl as a place where reality is constantly shifting between the physical and the fantastical. Blurring the lines, Chernobyl in the public imagination. Although the fictional works surrounding Chernobyl are compelling and entertaining, they have also contributed to a distorted view of the exclusion zone in the public imagination. The combination of real locations and supernatural or apocalyptic elements has led to the creation of a narrative that blurs the line between reality and myth. Many people around the world may know of Chernobyl primarily through these fictional portrayals rather than the actual history of the disaster and its aftermath. In reality, the Chernobyl exclusion zone remains a solemn reminder of the destructive potential of nuclear energy, as well as a site of scientific interest and environmental concern. However, in pop culture, it has evolved into a setting for horror, adventure, and speculative fiction. The actual human suffering caused by the disaster is often overshadowed by the focus on mutated creatures and radioactive anomalies, leading to a somewhat misleading portrayal of the region. The blending of fact and fiction in these works has undeniably influenced public perceptions of Chernobyl. In a way, these stories have contributed to the construction of an alternate mythology, one that focuses more on the thrills of exploration and horror than on the real, long-lasting effects of the disaster. Yet, in doing so, they have ensured that the memory of Chernobyl remains a subject of global fascination, continuing to inspire storytellers across generations. Conclusion. Chernobyl's role in pop culture is an intricate tapestry woven from a mixture of real history, creative imagination, and fictional embellishments. Video games, films, and books have all used the exclusion zone as a setting for exploring themes of horror, science fiction, and post-apocalyptic survival. While these works have captivated audiences worldwide, they have also shaped and sometimes distorted the public's understanding of the Chernobyl disaster. By blending the tragic reality of the disaster with supernatural or dystopian narratives, pop culture has created a modern mythos that continues to capture the public's imagination. The result is a paradoxical legacy, where the Chernobyl exclusion zone exists both as a symbol of environmental catastrophe and a playground for the imagination. This fusion of fact and fiction ensures that the memory of Chernobyl will continue to resonate, not just as a historical event but as a powerful and enduring narrative in popular culture. The contrast between scientific studies and folklore surrounding places like Chernobyl highlights the differences in understanding nature's resilience versus mythological exaggerations. Let's break it down. 1. Ecosystem resilience. Science. In the years following the Chernobyl disaster, researchers have documented that wildlife has not only survived but in some cases thrived in the exclusion zone. The absence of human activity has allowed ecosystems to regenerate, with animals such as wolves, lynxes, and Przelsky's horses making a comeback. The ecosystem has shown remarkable resilience despite the contamination. Folklore, legends and rumors often paint a different picture, with tales of mutated, monstrous creatures lurking in the abandoned zones. These stories fuel fear and fascination but are rarely backed by scientific evidence. 2. Radiation hotspots. Science. High levels of radiation persist in certain areas within the Chernobyl exclusion zone. These hotspots, especially around the reactor itself, pose serious risks to both humans and wildlife. However, these areas are not the breeding grounds for mythical creatures. The actual danger lies in the biological effects of radiation over time, such as cancer or reproductive issues, not grotesque mutations. Folklore. Stories of radioactive monsters often emerge, perpetuated by fear and misunderstanding of radiation's effects. These tales link the environment's danger to fantastical creatures, overshadowing the more subtle but real risks posed by radiation. 3. Deformities. Science. While radiation can indeed cause mutations, these tend to be subtle and not as striking as the deformed, monstrous creatures often imagined. Studies have observed changes in DNA, such as smaller or deformed animals, but these alterations are generally not the grotesque abnormalities commonly described in folklore. Popular culture tends to exaggerate these mutations, turning them into terrifying mutants or radioactive monsters. This is often more about sensationalism than science, driven by media portrayals rather than actual biological evidence. In summary, while radiation can indeed cause harm, the scientific studies show that nature's ability to recover and adapt is far more nuanced and less sensational than what is often portrayed in folklore. The wild creatures and extreme mutations typically belong more to the realm of myth than to reality, and the true effects of radiation are often more subtle and less dramatic. Myths and reality. The monsters of Chernobyl. Chernobyl, the site of the catastrophic nuclear disaster in 1986, continues to captivate the imagination of scientists, artists, researchers, and the general public alike. In the aftermath of the explosion, the the Chernobyl exclusion zone became the focal point of numerous theories, myths, and stories. Among the most persistent and intriguing are the so-called monsters of Chernobyl, deformed, terrifying creatures supposedly created by the extreme radiation levels. But do these monsters actually exist, or are they simply products of human imagination? To understand this, we must delve into scientific facts, historical context, and cultural interpretations. The Chernobyl disaster, a background. On April 26, 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, located in northern Ukraine, experienced one of the worst nuclear accidents in history. An explosion at reactor number 4 released large amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere, causing widespread contamination and forcing the evacuation of tens of thousands of people from the surrounding areas. While the human toll was significant, with thousands suffering from radiation-related illnesses, the true environmental impact of the disaster took decades to fully unfold. The area within a 30-kilometer radius around the plant, known as the Chernobyl exclusion zone, became a desolate and toxic wasteland. However, over time, something unexpected happened. Instead of becoming a barren, lifeless landscape, the exclusion zone began to show signs of wildlife resurgence. Animals, some of which had been scarce before the disaster, began to thrive in the absence of human activity. The harsh radiation environment, however, was thought to have had a profound impact on their genetic makeup. This gave rise to rumors of mutated and monstrous creatures roaming the zone. The birth of the monsters. In the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster, the media and popular culture began to portray the zone as a breeding ground for strange and mutated animals. Tales of three-headed dogs, giant, radioactive wolves, and other terrifying creatures began circulating, fueled by both local legends and sensational stories from those who had visited or worked in the area. One of the most widespread and enduring myths was that animals in the exclusion zone had developed terrifying deformities due to exposure to high radiation levels. Claims of mutated animals with extra limbs, oversized eyes, and other abnormalities seemed to fuel the notion of a monstrous Chernobyl ecosystem. However, these claims were not always supported by scientific evidence. While radiation exposure does cause mutations in living organisms, the majority of these mutations are typically harmful and often lethal. The kind of large, grotesque creatures portrayed in popular media were not being seen in reality. Instead, most of the animals found in the zone were still biologically normal, despite living in an environment contaminated by radiation. The reality: wildlife in the exclusion zone. Today, the Chernobyl exclusion zone is considered a remarkable example of environmental resilience. Since humans were evacuated, the area has become a haven for wildlife. Many species that had once been scarce in the region, such as wolves, wild boars, and various species of birds, have thrived in the absence of human interference. Some species, like the Przelsky's horse, have even been reintroduced to the area, benefiting from the newfound safety and space. Studies have shown that the radiation levels in the zone, although still present, are not as high as once believed, and they do not appear to be causing the widespread genetic mutations that many had feared. While there are some signs of DNA damage and health issues among certain animals, most species are surviving and even reproducing normally. The environment is far from ideal, but life finds a way to adapt. Interestingly, the presence of radiation in the zone may actually be benefiting certain species in ways that were not initially anticipated. For example, the lack of human hunting and interference has allowed animal populations to grow, and the relatively stable ecosystem has enabled biodiversity to thrive. The scientific perspective on mutations. While it's true that radiation exposure can lead to genetic mutations, the reality is far less dramatic than the mythical monsters often depicted in the media. In fact, the mutations caused by radiation tend to be harmful rather than beneficial, leading to genetic disorders, physical deformities, and even death. Some studies have been conducted on the wildlife in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, particularly regarding the genetic effects of radiation exposure. Research on the animals living there has shown some signs of genetic damage, but overall, the impact on most species has been less severe than expected. The animals in the zone are not monstrous or deformed in the way popular culture suggests, and while radiation has affected certain species, most have continued to adapt and thrive. For instance, Scientists have studied the mutation rates in various species of birds and found no conclusive evidence of mass mutations leading to the kinds of deformities often depicted in myths. Instead, the creatures of Chernobyl seem to be evolving in response to the extreme environmental pressures of radiation, just as species adapt to any harsh habitat. The role of popular culture. Despite the absence of any real evidence for mutated creatures, the monsters of Chernobyl remain an enduring symbol in popular culture. From films and documentaries to video games and novels, the myth of radioactive mutants has taken root in the collective imagination. This fascination with Chernobyl's monsters speaks to humanity's broader fear of the unknown and the consequences of technological overreach. The idea that the zone is populated by monstrous creatures is a powerful narrative that taps into our primal fears of disaster and the uncontrollable power of nature. It serves as a warning, not only about the dangers of nuclear energy but also about humanity's inability to fully understand the consequences of tampering with nature. The true monsters, resilience and survival. The true story of Chernobyl's monsters is not one of terrifying deformed creatures, but rather one of resilience and survival. The animals in the exclusion zone have shown an incredible ability to adapt to extreme conditions. In the absence of humans, the environment has slowly begun to heal itself, and species that were once on the brink of extinction are now thriving. In many ways, the real monsters of Chernobyl are not the animals but the invisible, lingering threat of radiation. The disaster's legacy is a reminder of the destructive power of human actions, but it is also a testament to the resilience of life in all its forms. Even in the shadow of disaster, life finds a way. Conclusion. The monsters of Chernobyl are a fascinating blend of reality and myth. While the environmental impact of the disaster is undeniable, the most terrifying creatures often exist only in the imagination. The exclusion zone remains a poignant reminder of the dangers of nuclear energy, a haven for wildlife, and a source of endless inspiration for storytellers. As science continues to study the zone, we gain a clearer understanding of how life adapts to extreme conditions. The real story of Chernobyl's monsters is one of resilience and survival, proving that even in the shadow of disaster, life finds a way.